A wooden staff swung down through the cold air. It stopped an inch from a woman's skull. A dog lunged, teeth bared, and the whole crowd gasped and stumbled back. The woman did not flinch. She could not see the blow coming, but she felt the wind of it on her face. Her hands stayed folded. Her chin stayed up. Behind her, the dog snarled low and steady, a warning to every man in the clearing. The old man raised the staff again, higher this time, meaning to finish what he started. That was when the pines went silent. A shape stepped out of the trees, tall, broad-shouldered. He did not hurry, and the blind woman's name was Ilara Voss, and the man walking toward her was the Lycan king. What did he say that made an entire council of elders lower their eyes? Stay with me on this one. Long before that staff swung, Ilara Voss was known as the finest pair of hands in the valley. She could not see the cloth she worked, but she did not need to. She read fabric the way other people read faces. A snag under her thumb, a loose thread near a seam, the weight of good wool against thin. She would run her fingers across a length of cloth once and tell you where the weaver had rushed. Every family in Hollow Pine Ridge had something of hers in their home. A christening gown, a burial shroud, a cloak stitched tight enough to keep the winter out. She lived alone at the edge of the settlement, and she was never really alone because Bram was always there. Bram was a silver wolfhound, half wild, big enough to put his paws on a grown man's shoulders. Nobody knew where he had come from. He had walked out of the tree line one hard winter and sat down at her door, and he had never left. He slept across her threshold. He walked her to the well. When strangers came too close, he stepped between them and her without a sound, and something in his eyes made them think twice. Now here's the thing. In a place like Hollow Pine Ridge, being useful is not the same as being safe. The pack lived by old rules. The council of elders sat above everyone, 7 old men and women in gray who claimed to speak for the moon and the land. They blessed the hunts. They decided who ate first when food ran low. And for years, they had watched Ilara the way you watch a stone in your boot. A blind girl who could find a dropped needle in the dark. A blind girl whose stitching never wandered. A blind girl who sometimes, while her hands worked, said things she had no way of knowing. That last part frightened them most, because Ilara wove pictures, not by design. She would set out to make a plain blanket and her fingers would drift, and by the time she was done there would be shapes in the wool. A tall tree split down the middle, a river running the wrong way. A ring of figures around a fire and one figure lying still on the ground. She never planned them. She said the patterns came through her hands like water through a crack. Most folk found it charming. The elders did not. Then the harvest failed. It failed hard. The root cellars stood half empty. The grain came up thin and black at the tips. The deer moved off into the deep woods and did not come back. Winter arrived early and mean, and by the first heavy snow, mothers were watering the soup and counting the days until spring. A frightened pack looks for a reason, and a frightened pack, when the elders point a finger, tends to look where the finger points. The eldest of them was a man named Cale Thornwood, thin, dry, with a voice like a door dragging over stone. He stood before the whole settlement one gray morning and said the land was cursed. He said the moon had turned its face from Hollow Pine Ridge because something unclean lived among them. And then he said the word that would follow Ilara for the rest of that terrible week. Witch. He didn't shout it. He didn't have to. He let it fall into the quiet and let the fear do the rest. He reminded them of the pictures in her weaving, the still figure by the fire, the river running backward. He said she had woven their ruin into wool before it came to pass, and a person who could see disaster coming was a person who had a hand in making it. That is not logic, but fear is not logic. By nightfall, people who had bought her cloaks for years would not meet her at the well. Ilara felt it change around her. She could not see the sideways looks, but she could hear the conversations that stopped when she came near. She could feel the space open up around her in the market, people stepping back as if her blindness were something they could catch. Bram felt it too. He stopped sleeping. He stood at the window through the long nights, ears up, a low sound rolling in his chest. She kept working. What else could she do? She stitched by the fire and told herself it would pass, the way hard talk passes once bellies are full again. She was half right, they were scared. But they were not looking for somewhere to put the blame. They already knew exactly where it belonged. And that was the problem, because Cale Thornwood knew the harvest was not cursed. He knew what had truly starved Hollow Pine Ridge. And he knew that the only person in the valley who had come anywhere close to the truth was a blind seamstress who kept weaving it into her blankets without even knowing what she saw. That is a dangerous thing to be. Not wrong. Right, when the powerful need you quiet. On the 7th night, 2 men came to her door with a lantern and a length of rope, and they did not knock. Bram met them first. He hit the first man in the chest before the door was fully open and put him flat on his back in the snow. The second swung the lantern and caught the dog across the shoulder, and Bram yelped and rolled and came up snarling. Alara was on her feet, one hand out for the wall, calling the dog back, her heart slamming. She heard the crack of the lantern breaking. She heard a man cursing. She heard the wet sound of the dog's teeth finding a sleeve, and then a third voice from the dark, older, colder, telling them to stop. It was Cale. He had come to watch. They did not bind her that night. They didn't need to. Bram would have died before he let them, and even Cale was not ready to spill blood on her threshold with the whole settlement listening. Instead, the old man stood in her doorway and told her the council would hear her case at dawn in the clearing by the split pine. Come, he said, or they would come for her, and next time they would bring more than 2 men and 1 lantern. Then he left her standing in the wreck of her own home, with a bleeding dog pressed against her leg and her whole life turning to ash around her. She did not sleep. She sat on the floor with her arms around Bram's neck and her fingers pressed to the cut on his shoulder, and she waited for a dawn she could not see. Dawn came the color of ash. Alara walked to the clearing with one hand on Bram's back and the other holding her shawl closed at her throat. She had woven that shawl herself. There was a shape in it, a ring of figures around a fire and one figure standing apart. She had not understood it when she made it. She was beginning to now. The whole settlement had come. 100 people, maybe more, packed into the trees, and not one of them said a word to her as she passed. That silence told her everything. These were people she had clothed. People whose dead she had wrapped for burial, and they had already decided. The 7 elders sat on a bench of split logs at the far end. Cale Thornwood stood in front, leaning on his staff, and he wasted no time. He listed her crimes the way a man reads a bill. She was blind, yet she found what the sighted could not. She wove pictures of doom. She kept a beast at her side that answered to her alone. And the harvest, he said, had rotted from the day her weaving first showed a black tree. He asked her if she denied it. Alara lifted her chin. She said she did not curse the land. She said she had never wished harm on a single soul in Hollow Pine Ridge, and that half the people standing in those trees were warm right now because of cloth she had made with her own hands. Her voice did not shake. That was the strange part. She had been afraid all night, but standing in front of them now, something in her had gone quiet and steady. She asked Cale a question of her own. She asked why, if the moon was truly angry, the tithe cellars under the council hall had been emptied and refilled 3 times that autumn while the people's cellars stood bare. She said she could not see, but she could count, and she counted the wagons that rolled up to the council hall in the dark and rolled away empty toward the tree line. The clearing went very still. It was the wrong question to ask, or the right one, depending on how you look at it. Cale's face did not move, but his knuckles went white on the staff. And in that moment, Alara understood she had touched the true thing, the thing under all the talk of curses, and that touching it had just cost her whatever small chance she'd had. Cale's voice rose. He did not answer her. He turned to the crowd and said she had confessed. He said only a witch would speak of what happened in the dark. He called for the old sentence, the one they had not used in 3 generations. She was to be cast out, past the boundary stones into the deep woods where the winter did the council's work for them. No food, no fire, no dog, because the beast would be put down at the boundary. That last part broke her calm. She said his name. She said no. She reached down for Bram and felt him press hard against her legs, shaking, not with fear but with rage. 2 men came forward with a pole and a loop of rope meant for the dog's neck. Bram met them low and fast and drove one of them back into the crowd. People were shouting now. Somewhere a child was crying, and Cale Thornwood decided he had heard enough. He stepped toward Alara with his staff raised, not the ceremonial lift of a man passing sentence. A real swing, meant to land, meant to end the argument the fast way while the pack was frightened enough to allow it. Alara heard the crowd draw breath. She felt Bram tear free from her side. And she felt the wind of that heavy staff coming down toward her head, and there was nothing she could do because she could not see it, and there was no one in that whole clearing who would raise a hand to stop it. The staff swung down. It stopped an inch from her skull, because between one breath and the next, the pines went silent and a man walked out of the trees. Nobody had heard him come. That alone made people afraid. You do not sneak up on 100 wolves, but he had, and now he stood at the edge of the clearing, tall and broad and unhurried, and the temperature of the whole gathering seemed to drop. Alara did not know who he was yet, but she felt the crowd shrink back. She felt Cale freeze mid-swing. The man's voice, when it came, was low, almost gentle, and it carried to every corner of that clearing without him raising it at all. He said, "Put it down." Cale turned and the blood left his face. He knew that voice. Every elder on that bench knew it. The man walking toward them was Dorian Ashcroft, and Dorian Ashcroft was the Lycan king. Here's what you have to understand. The elders of Hollow Pine Ridge ruled a valley. Dorian ruled everything the valley belonged to and a dozen more valleys besides. The pack lands answered to him. The old bloodlines answered to him. He was the last of a line that ran back further than any elder's memory, and the power in him was not a story or a title. It was real, and it was standing in their clearing. He walked straight through the crowd, and the crowd opened for him like water. He stopped between Alara and Cale's raised staff, and he looked down at the old man, and the whole valley held its breath. He said, "Who dared to touch what is mine?" The words landed like a stone in a still pond. Mine. Alara stood frozen, not understanding, and Cale stammered that there had been a mistake, that the girl was a witch, that the council had passed lawful sentence. Dorian let him talk. Then he reached out slow and took the staff out of Cale's hands the way you take a toy from a child, and he snapped it across his knee and dropped the pieces in the snow. He turned to Alara, and his voice changed. It went quiet, meant only for her, though the whole clearing strained to hear. He said, "I have been looking for you for a very long time." Alara did not know what he meant. She only knew that the man in front of her smelled of pine and cold iron and something older, and that when he spoke, Bram, who trusted no one, who had bitten 2 men that morning, stopped growling and sat down in the snow at his feet. That more than anything told her something enormous had just changed. Dorian faced the council. He said the girl was under his protection from this moment, that she was his and no one else's, and that any hand raised against her would answer to him. Then he told Cale that he and the council would come to the King's Keep in 3 days to explain, in full, where the tithe wagons had been going in the dark. Cale's face went the color of old ash. And then Dorian offered Alara his arm, and she took it, and he led her out of the clearing while 100 people who had come to watch her die stood in silence and let her pass. Bram walked at her other side, head high. Nobody dared move to stop them. They walked a long way through the trees, up into the hills, until the sounds of the settlement faded behind them. When Alara asked softly why he had called her his, he only said, "Because you are. You have been since before either of us was born. I will explain when you are warm." And there was something so certain in it that she did not press. The king's keep was a great old hall of stone and dark timber, and it was warm. That was the first thing she noticed. Dorian sat her by the fire. He wrapped a heavy fur around her shoulders. He put a cup of something hot and sweet in her hands and folded her fingers around it. He knelt and cleaned the cut on Bram's shoulder himself, and the great dog let him, which Alara would not have believed if she had not felt it. For the first time in 7 days, Alara let herself breathe. She sat by that fire with the fur around her and Bram's head heavy on her feet, and she felt the tight thing in her chest begin to loosen. She was safe. It was over. The elders were far away and afraid, and the winter could not reach her here, and a man who ruled the whole of the Pack lands had stood in the snow and called her his and meant it. She turned her face toward the warmth. She thought, for the first time in a week, about tomorrow. She thought she might sleep. Then Dorian went very still beside her, and the fire seemed to dim, and he said one word, low and hard. He said, "Down." She heard the great doors of the hall groan open, and cold air rolled across the floor, and Bram was on his feet with every hair on his body standing up. Because Cale Thornwood had not waited 3 days. Cale Thornwood had come that same night, and he had not come to explain. He had come with the warden. Now, I need to tell you who the warden was, because that is the moment this stopped being a story about a blind girl and an angry council. The elders of Hollow Pine Ridge were small men, frightened men, guarding a small crime. But above the elders, above even the king in one narrow and terrible way, there was an older institution. The wardens of the deep were the keepers of the old packs, the debts the packs had sworn to the thing that lived in the deep woods long before there were kings. And the warden who walked into Dorian's hall that night was there to collect. Because this is the truth Cale had been hiding. The harvest had not failed by chance, and it had not failed by any curse of Alara's. It had failed because Cale and the council had stopped paying the tithe. For generations, Hollow Pine Ridge had sent a portion of every harvest into the deep woods, to the old thing the first packs had bargained with. The wagons in the dark, that was the debt. And Cale, greedy and proud, had begun keeping the tithe for himself, refilling the council's cellars 3 times while the people starved, telling himself the old pact was just a story. The old pact was not a story, and when the tithe stopped, the thing in the woods took its payment from the land instead. The blackened grain, the vanished deer, the killing winter, that was the curse. Cale had made it himself, and he needed a witch to blame fast before anyone counted the wagons. He'd chosen Alara because she'd already, without knowing it, woven the truth into wool. The ring of figures around the fire, the one figure lying still, the river running backward. Her hands had been drawing the old pact, and it's breaking for a year, and Cale could not have that hanging in blankets all over the valley. So he called her cursed, and he tried to bury the evidence in the snow past the tree line. And now here's where it turned again. The warden did not come for Cale. Debts of the pact do not fall on the man. They fall on the blood, on the line. And the oldest surviving line in Hollow Pine Ridge, the true bloodline the pact had first been sworn on, was not Cale's. It was Alara's. That was why she could weave what she wove. That was why a blind girl could find a needle in the dark, why her hands drew truths she never saw. She carried the old sight, the moon blindness, the mark of the founding line. Her eyes had gone dark so the inward eye could open. Cale had known it for years. It was the real reason he feared her, not because she was a witch. Because she was the rightful keeper of the pact he had broken, and as long as she lived and remembered, His crime had a witness the whole valley would eventually believe. The warden came to collect the broken debt from the last of that line, from Alara, and Kale had led him straight to her, hoping the old power would do what his 2 men and 1 lantern had failed to do at her door. If you've made it this far and you're still with me, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, because what Dorian did next is the whole reason I wanted to tell you this story. The warden crossed the hall. It moved wrong, too smooth, like something wearing a shape rather than born to it, and where it passed, the fire leaned away. It spoke in a voice like wind through a hollow log, and it named the debt: 9 harvests unpaid. The pact demanded the keeper of the line body and breath to close the account. It pointed a long gray hand at Alara. Kale actually smiled. You could hear it in his voice when he spoke up, quick and greasy, telling the warden yes, this was the one, take her and let the account be closed and the winter lifted. He thought he had won. He thought he had found a way to hand the king's new favorite to the one power the king could not simply break and walk away clean. Dorian stood up. He stood up slow, and he put himself between Alara and the warden, and Bram took his place at his side. And for a moment the king said nothing at all. Then he asked the warden a question. He asked, who broke the pact? The warden did not lie. The old powers cannot. It said the keeper's blood had ceased to pay. Dorian said that was not what he asked. He asked who had held the harvest back, who had emptied the wagons and filled his own cellars, whose hand had stopped the tithe. And the hall went silent because everyone understood that the warden's answer would either save Alara or damn her. The warden turned its head slow toward Kale Thornwood, and it said, that one. Kale started to run. He did not get 3 steps. Dorian did not chase him. He simply spoke, and there was a weight in it now, the full weight of what he was, and Kale's legs stopped working and he went down on his knees on the cold stone. Dorian walked to him. He crouched to Kale's level and he spoke quietly, the way he had spoken to Alara by the fire, except now there was nothing gentle in it. He said, you stole from your own people. You starved children through a killing winter to fatten your cellars. And when the debt came due, you dressed a blind woman in your guilt and tried to feed her to it. He let that sit. Then he said, you want to know the difference between you and her. She wove the truth without ever seeing it. You saw the truth every single day, and you chose the lie. Kale begged. Of course he did. He offered the cellars back. He offered the wagons, the grain, everything. Dorian turned away from him because there are men whose begging is just one more thing they're stealing, and he was done listening. He faced the warden. And here is the thing about Dorian Ashcroft that the elders had forgotten. The king was not only the ruler of the pack lands, he was the heir to the other half of every old pact. The founding lines and the crown had sworn those debts together, keeper and king, 2 hands on the same oath. The pact could take the keeper's blood, or it could take the equal blood of the crown that stood surety for her. That was old law too, older than the wardens, and Dorian knew it because he had spent his whole life reading the things the elders had let rot. He offered himself in Alara's place. The hall erupted. Alara was on her feet, reaching for him, saying no. Bram was between them and the warden, snarling. And Dorian, calm as still water, said the pact would be honored, but not with an innocent woman's life. He said the crown stood surety. He rolled back his sleeve and offered his arm to the gray hand, and he told the warden to take the price from him and let the account be closed and the winter lifted from Hollow Pine Ridge. The warden reached for him, and Alara moved. She could not see. But she had spent her whole life knowing exactly where things were by sound and air and the press of the floor, and she crossed that hall faster than anyone thought a blind woman could. And she got between Dorian and the gray hand, and she did the one thing no one expected. She did not beg. She spoke to the warden in the old words, the founding words. The keeper's words, that had been sleeping in her blood her whole life and came pouring out of her now like water through a crack. She named the true debt. 9 harvests, taken by one man, held in one place. She said the pact demanded payment of what was owed, no more, and that what was owed was in the council cellars this very night, grain and blood both, and that the keeper of the line, which she now claimed out loud for the first time, invoked the old right to pay the debt in full from the guilty, not the innocent. The warden stopped. It considered her. And then, because the old powers must honor the exact shape of a debt when the true keeper names it, it lowered its hand from Dorian's arm. It turned toward Cale Thornwood, who was still on his knees on the cold stone. And it said, in that voice like wind through a hollow log, that the account would be closed from the one who had emptied it. I will not tell you everything the warden did to Cale. You do not need it, and neither do I. I will tell you that it was quick, and that when it was done, the fire in the great hall stood straight up again and grew warm, and the killing cold that had gripped the valley for a season broke that very night. By morning, water was dripping from the eaves. The deep woods let go of hollow Pine Ridge, and the account was closed, and the wardens went back to their silence with the debt paid in full and in kind. Elara stood in the middle of the hall, shaking, and Dorian came and put his arms around her, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. The thaw came slow after that, the way real thaws do. By the time the snow was gone from the low fields, the people of Hollow Pine Ridge had heard the whole of it. How the harvest had failed because their own council robbed them. How the wagons in the dark had carried their survival into Cale Thornwood's cellars. How the blind seamstress they had come to stone was the keeper of the oldest and truest line in the valley, and how she had stood between the king and the old power and paid a debt that was never hers to pay. They did not know how to face her. That is the honest truth. Shame is a hard thing to carry back to someone's door. The men who had come with the rope and the lantern left the valley entirely. The 6 elders who had sat on that bench and said nothing while Cale raised his staff came one by one to the king's keep with their heads down. Dorian let Elara decide what to do with them. She did not have them cast out. She was not built that way. She told them they would open the council cellars to every family in the valley, and they would spend the spring rebuilding the homes that had gone cold, and they would sit on that bench again only when the people, not the moon, chose to put them there. It was a harder sentence than exile, in its way. It made them useful to the very people they had failed. She thought that was fitting. She went back to her cottage once, with Dorian and Bram. She stood in the doorway with her hand on the frame and ran her fingers over the loom in the corner, still strung with the last thing she had been weaving before all of it began. The shawl with the ring of figures and the one standing apart. She understood it now. It had never been a curse. It had been a memory her blood was trying to give her, of the pact and the line and the keeper who would one day have to stand up. Her hands had known who she was long before she did. Dorian asked her, standing there in the cold cottage, whether she would come and live at the keep. Not as a prisoner, not as a debt he had bought. He told her the rest of the truth then, the part he had been carrying since the moment he walked out of the pines. That the king and the founding keeper were meant to stand together, always had, 2 halves of one oath. That the pull he had felt toward the valley all winter, the thing that had drawn him out of his hills into that clearing at the exact moment a staff was falling, had a name, and the name was her. The bond was real. It was old. He had felt it wake the first time he caught her scent on the wind, and he had walked half a season to find its source. Elara listened, and then she smiled, the first real smile since autumn, and she said she had felt it too. She had thought it was fear at first, that steady certainty in the middle of the clearing that would not let her flinch even with a staff coming down. But it wasn't fear. It was recognition. Some part of her had known when that low voice said put it down that the other half of her oath had finally come to stand beside her. She did not answer his question with words. She reached out and found his hand, the way she found everything, by air and warmth and knowing. And she held on. They were bonded before the first flowers came up through the mud. There was no great ceremony, because Ilara did not care for crowds after what a crowd had nearly done to her. There was a fire and the 6 chastened elders as witnesses, and the whole grateful valley outside the doors, and Bram lying across the threshold the way he always had, guarding the only thing he had ever chosen to guard. Dorian spoke the king's half of the old oath. Ilara spoke the keeper's half in the founding words, and this time she knew exactly what they meant. And here is where the story ends, so let me leave you with this. Remember how it started. A blind woman in a clearing, alone, with a staff coming down and 100 people who would not lift a hand. Everyone in that clearing saw a helpless girl. They were wrong. She was the strongest person there. She just couldn't see it yet, and neither could they. The eldest raised his staff because he thought no one would stop him. The king stepped out of the pines because someone always should. And the blind girl they tried to throw away turned out to be the one holding the whole valley together, keeper of an oath older than the men who condemned her. Cale Thornwood spent his life looking down on a woman who could not see, and in the end, she saw the one thing he never could. She saw the truth. She always had. They lived a long time after that, the king and the keeper and the half-wild dog who found her first. The harvests came back full. The wagons rolled in daylight, honest and openly counted. And on the coldest nights when the fire was high in the great hall, Ilara would sit at her loom with Dorian's hand on her shoulder and Bram at her feet, and she would weave. Not curses, not warnings. Just cloth, warm and true and made to keep the winter out. Because that, in the end, was all she had ever wanted to do. And now, at last, nobody in the whole of the Packlands would dare to take it from her.